St. Thomas Aquinas, in the Secunda Secundae, around the section beginning 180, goes into the states of life and compares one with the other as regards its dignity and comparability and eventual superiority or inferiority. And he has something akin to what we have in this gospel now regarding what he sees as the completeness. He indicates that to shed light and therefore warmth upon those around is to allow them to benefit from the light and warmth received. And that as in the light and life and warmth of the Lord, this was the case. He was uncreated light, he was warmth of Trinitarian style, but able to beam and heal wherever he was. So too, the soul, fully engaged, as we would say, plugged in, if he then transmits, is actually doing more than the soul just on fire and being warmed. It is the principle of the mixed life, so-called. What is resumed in Thomas Aquinas' formula, contemplari, to contemplate, which actually means to gaze at, et contemplata, and the thing is contemplated, aliis, tradere, to others, to hand over, to give then what is received. But notice it has been received. And that is the bottom line when it comes to any communication of grace-filled truth. Where is it coming from? We notice in the first reading a scenario not dissimilar to what we are used to in our age. The actual Greek talks about itching ears, wanting to be scratched. People like to be titillated by something new and inventive. But is it received from that source of the uncreated light, or is it more of me using this stage for glory, because I have thought of something no one else did hitherto? If we have meagre fruit in much of our preaching and evangelization, one perhaps might ask, why? The saint of this day, Peter Chrysologus, is a good example of the real thing. Like many, he has acquired a nickname by the which the centuries know him. He lived at the same period, nearly identically actually, as another one who suffered the same fate of a long-living nickname, Chrysostomus. The golden-mouthed John Chrysostomus, who was actually one of the main figures of the time because he was patriarch of the East, Constantinople. But he was driven into exile because of his fidelity precisely to the truth. But he was a monk and knew what was what. This one, Peter Chrysologus, which means golden-worded, was one of the greatest preachers of the early church and was proclaimed doctor of the church not that long ago as time goes in church history. Actually that's John Damascene, who was feasted on this day in the new calendar, but they're of the same ilk. He was Archbishop of Ravenna, a native of Imola, that's in the north of Italy, and he was a deacon there when chosen bishop. That actually used to happen quite often. The deacons were future bishops. And sometimes a strange thing would happen. They would sometimes, occasionally, be ordained per saltum, by jump. And it was a problem for theologians, but it was answered that the episcopacy contains all, and therefore they received automatically the priesthood also. So, he enjoyed the confidence of Leo the Great, who was the great defender, remember, of Trinitarian truth in Christology, whose teaching on the Incarnation he strongly supported. He had to fight against this heresy of Eutychus. But there are no new heresies, really, in time. The kind of things that come out now in our day are recycled ancient heresies. And the Lord is obliged, for that reason, to remind us that certain things have not changed. This was given to me by one of you just the other day, and it is recent. It is a gentle hint from on high that certain things have not changed. You can't see it from where you are, but you can imagine what it is. It's yet again a host which has been put in water. The actual circumstance apparently was this: it was given to a child who either had not made his first communion or was not baptized. And anyway, it was not consumed and presented back to the priest eventually, who did not consume it but placed it in water. And before your eyes you can see what is starting to happen. Yet again, this miracle, which by now we're almost used to, has and is taking place. This is recent in time now. We can see the Lord reminding us that once the words of consecration are pronounced, it is truly his body, and he does not particularly like to be put in this situation. Now, there is more. I mentioned that the teaching given to Timothy by his master, St. Paul, as he is a young bishop, is something which crosses the centuries and is addressed also to us. He is to proclaim the truth in season and out of season. Remember, he was a young man. He's warned not to be shy or to think of his age as a handicap. And he is also to make sure that he's actually evangelizing, do the work of an evangelizer. Now remember what that means in that situation. You're handling the first impetus. As now, it can still happen in real mission areas. It's hand-to-hand combat with what's out there. In pagan Greek culture, it was all intertwined with worship of the gods, but the gods were not good examples. All this stuff, which included some kind of sacred prostitution or whatever it might be, the glorifying of alcohol under the name of Dionysius and so on, it was all a messy business. And St. Paul has to handle it when he's writing to the Corinthians. So this first wave of evangelization is something that had to be serious and conquering. I remember hearing this from missionaries when I was in Rome, living with Americans, and they were missionaries, Maryknoll missionaries. They were amongst themselves discussing the plight of modern mission, that they found themselves quite often now in different parts of the world unable to conquer for Christ by direct evangelization. They were limited in practice to presence to the culture in high-powered education. Well, it had its value, but it's not exactly direct evangelization. But those same people would know what true evangelization was. The stories that the rector, who was an old man by then, would come out with in his early days as a missionary down there was something else. He knew what it was to have to deal with sorcery and stuff in the congregation. And I may mention before how one of our brethren from St. Antimo went down to Africa, to the Côte d'Ivoire, and he was giving benediction with the Blessed Sacrament. And this lady before him in a packed church levitated from the ground and stood suspended between heaven and earth, and then was dashed against a wall at the moment of making the sign of the cross with the sacred host. That woman had been in league with the other guy, who wasn't happy at all to be exposed to the rays of grace and glory coming from the monstrance, and we were all reminded of that truth. But with regard to this, What is happening in our day is this. In practice, the hitherto Christian lands, where grace was and is still to a large extent present compared with darkest Africa, where there's a huge amount of area where there's no holy sacrifice or priest, these areas now, while maintaining the structure, are actually massively neo-pagan. And that means that the devil has found a way of making grace without effect. And then we try to get things back by programming things with perfect pastoral ideas. Well, this, which was also given to me by somebody here, is a good example of the kind of result that follows. This fairly young priest was discouraged. He'd done everything and nothing was working. He decided to go on pilgrimage to Fatima to put his burden before Our Blessed Lady. He happened to bump into this other priest who listened to his story. And without going into detail, what he came out with is this teaching which he's put down, which is nothing less than a living example of what happened without the slightest pastoral program. Humanly desperate. It was a Vietnamese priest somewhere in the States who could hardly speak English and certainly couldn't preach. He even had difficulty in socializing because he had this difficulty with the language. But he had one thing that no priest in the whole area had. He was on fire for Jesus Christ in the host. He would spend lots and lots of time at the foot of the altar. And he would not tolerate anything which his inner instinct knew not to be the maximum for God. So, against all odds, he just had what had worked in the past, and strangely enough, began to work again. Only altar boys, which he formed personally with the same love of Christ and his mysteries. Only Holy Communion kneeling and insisting that no demolition be done to the church as he'd received it. Only celebration according to the exact rubrics given by the present missal. His preaching was desperate, but one thing was different. All he said was true. And he said things as they were. No unconsecrated hand was allowed to touch or distribute the Blessed Sacrament, for he loved the Lord and by instinct felt he had to defend him. Indeed, as time went on, people came out of the woodwork, out of curiosity, but came back. The numbers grew. The numbers grew. The numbers grew and grew in such a way that several priests had to be present, certainly on a Sunday, but actually even on a weekday, to give Holy Communion themselves to this unexpected crowd that no one had evangelized by modern means, but that the Holy Spirit had reached by his own. All this was purely vertical, and the Lord was free to bless it. Bring in a fantastically electrified team of missioners who inject a great feel-good factor in the whole parish and disobey the rubrics, and it will have the same result. More of the human. No challenge. No honor or glory for God. Modernize the seminary with all the greatest attractions for young people, including utter freedom, and you'll find that you have an awful lot of human activity going on. But the Lord will not be involved, and probably you'll find that down the line, the seminary will close its doors. Do you know that the most flourishing seminary in Rome when I was there was of all the North American College. The most orthodox, the most demanding. The students always wore their clericals in class and in the streets. They had a lot, and I mean a lot, of Eucharistic adoration. They were all obliged to have a spiritual director, and they all came there by choice, wanting to be close to the Pope, at the time St. John Paul II. There were about 200 students there, the cream of the American church. This was vertical, and the Lord was free to bless it. I leave it with you, my friends. Honour the Lord, and he'll honour his own. Do your own thing, and your own thing will come back.
Last Sunday, as deacon at our High Mass at St. Antimo Abbey. O peace, I have found all. I have come home, and 'twas not very far. 'Twas at the door of this, the tent of meeting, where there come again at whiles the wings I heard before, hard by the Master watching. I have been alone with these my brethren oft a time, when youth was strong and truth in fire was seen. Yet 'twas ere now ne'er given here too to climb. For on the morrow stands the Lord of all, awaiting with the hand that made the years. And here, anon, a syllable too small to hold the cosmos well will touch my ears. My ears, I say, my hands, my singed soul, and utter naught will Godhead court control.